thank everybody for coming. This is a joyous occasion. Friends and family and old friends and new friends. And we're going to begin with Robert Jonas, affectionately known as Jonas. He's a former lay brother of the Carmelite monastic order. He was raised as a in the Midwest as a Lutheran. As a Lutheran, I got that right. And since that time, now he's playing a shakuhachi Zen flute, which has its origins in China thousands of years ago. And this is a bamboo flute. And they play it in temples, in Zen temples. And the phrase is, becoming Buddha in one breath. So, and Buddha has a lot to do with our reading today.
By the way, that sounds simple, one breath. This is what the music looks like.
So this is Japanese, yeah. And he's also a Zen practitioner, but he's also the founder of Empty Bell, a contemplative sanctuary where interfaith dialogue and discussion and contemplation takes place. And I met Jonas 7 years ago, and it's one of the great blessings in my life that I met him. And so Jonas is going to bless us now with a prelude. And the name of the prelude?
Bamboo Breath.
Bamboo Breath, there you go.
Just made that up.
Okay.
Well, I invite you to close your eyes and just notice breathing, how precious this is, that we are breathing. There will be a time when we're not breathing. So every breath is a beautiful gift. Thank you, John. Okay. So I wanted to begin today. My name is Danny Shanahan. This is my wife, Carla B. here. And without Carla, there would be no reason for poetry in my life. So thank you, Carla. And so what I wanted to do was to just introduce a map of the reading that we're going to walk through together today. And the ground we stand on, actually, the title for the book, the e-book is being launched, as it's being launched now. It's an e-book. And if you write your name down, I can have that email to you. But my brother called me one day, a number of years ago, to go to the gravesite of our family. And while we were standing there, he was wearing a baseball hat, and he asked me to sing. And I couldn't refuse him. And I couldn't refuse them, their names beveled in granite. holding them up above ground, the ground we stand on. So that's where the title comes from. And so I've always been fascinated by history, and there's an arc of history here in the valley, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the poems will take us into the spiritual and emotional history of life in the city. So 190 million years ago, these dinosaurs left their footprints at the dinosaur tracks just north of the entrance to Mountain Park. And oftentimes I've gone down there and sat by those dinosaur tracks and kind of daydreamed about their presence here. And they left their prints 190 million years ago as they browsed, and it was a rainforest then. And then what happened 2 million years ago is that there was the Laurentide ice sheet, this massive ice sheet that covered most of North America. And at about 10 or 15,000 years ago, it melted and it created a lake called Lake Hitchcock, which spread across all the way from New Hampshire and Vermont through Massachusetts, all the way down to Rocky Hill, New Britain, Middletown area. And there was some earthquake activity there, and there was a dam that formed of itself, and it broke, and that flowed into Long Island Sound, and that's why we have the Connecticut River, and that's why we have all the mills that developed here using water power, and that's why Holyoke was a great success for many, many years, and still is. It's going through a new success. I was born on Nonotuck Street, but there was never any mention of the Native Americans in our lexicon, in our history. It just wasn't something that was present. It was already here on the mural at the entrance to the building, Santi Graziani's beautiful painting here. These are either Algonquin, Nonotuck, Pocumtuck. The Nonotuck means the midpoint in the river, by the way. And so somebody knew that it was about 400 miles from the source of, or the source of the river up north, all the way down to Long Island Sound. Because the Connecticut River was really a trade route. So they knew, in West Holyoke, these Native Americans farmed here. They grew things here in West Holyoke. And this word here is a beautiful Americanization, Anglicanization. It's Kineticook. And you can feel, I think you can feel the wood in the water there. It's almost like Gaelic. I don't know if you've heard Gaelic before, but Gaelic is, there's barely any vowels in it. It'll break your teeth while you're talking. But it's a beautiful, beautiful language. There were 2 dams. The first one lasted about 6 hours, I think, and then it broke. And then another one was built not 5 or 6 years later, and we're still, now it's powering the city. Originally it was powering the mills along the canals. Now it's lumens, it's actually H2O to lumens. They're taking this water and turning it into light. Don't you love that? Yeah. And of course, there's the canals, and there were silk mills here, and there were paper mills. And that's one of the poems in the new book. The song the river sings beneath the factories looking for work to power a turbine, a bobbin spinner, a paper cutter. Sometimes I'll drive down by the canals on the way back from Enfield where I work, and I'll just listen to those canals hissing underneath the factory floorboards. And I've let that move me to find the language for that poem. Because language comes from the earth. When we first started naming things as human beings, if you could name things, you had power. So the silk moth is featured in one of the poems, and we'll talk about that. And actually, this particular poem, I love this poem because there's a diorama up in Wistariahurst Museum that I saw many years ago, and it was in a glass diorama. There was a factory, and then there was a large papier-mâché type silk moth contained, and so that's the source of this poem. The ragman, many people here in Holyoke remember the ragman. He used to ride through the neighborhoods. And by the way, we have some posters of the poems in the back if you want to just take some, and if you want to offer a donation, that'd be wonderful. And my mother had one of these mangles in the kitchen. So that's a poem. I wouldn't be here today. I don't think I would have survived the darkness in my life if it hadn't been for this library. Because regardless of how dark it got in my life, what it gave me, I was able to hang on to. And that was poetry and literature and history, architecture. I believe the library is a spiritual center for the city now. And I used to sleep on these floors here after school, after my father died. My mother was working 3 jobs. And these are opaque glass cubes, yeah. And there's a poem about the library that I'll get to. And I love, every time I came into this building, I loved coming into the library lobby. It was like this galactic cockpit to the universe. You know, it was just, I mean, right up at top, Graziani's photograph or painting, beautiful masterpiece of the Native Americans was right there, and Thomas Holyoke was right there. And, just otherworldly. Also, we spent some time in an orphanage. It was not uncommon then for families who had health problems or other problems, and children were cared for by a nursery right next to Providence Hospital, the old brownstone building there. And so I dedicated that poem to the children who have been separated from their parents at the border, at the Trump Wall in Mexico, along the Mexico-U.S. border. And Jonas is going to be playing a piece, Thomas Dorsey, who lost his wife and daughter, and wrote a piece for them. So that's it. And so I'm going to start reading now. Jonas, can I use your... Okay, good. Thank you, brother. Okay. Thank you, brother. Okay. So I'm just going to hand this around. This is the copy of the book that kind of depicts the arc of time we're going to discuss today. The imagination is like a river reflecting moonlight. The imagination is like a river reflecting moonlight. Like the grass intoxicated with rain. Let this river sing to you. Be like the grass when it rains. Be like the grass when it rains. A silk moth in Holyoke. There was a moth from Kabuki, Japan, and it was said made thread with a lineage from China 3,000 years old. When its eggs hatched, stars were stitched upon their backs. As caterpillars, they mused and grazed at 0 speed on green fields of mulberry leaves. In such idle ways, they dreamed themselves into cocoons, dangled in their solitudes, pupas pulsing with the moon. In such idle ways, they dreamed themselves into cocoons, dangled in their solitudes, pupas pulsing with the moon. And when they woke, their work began, spinning silk for my mother, who sewed by hand buttonholes and linings, I recall, for a sweater she made for me one fall. Little moth, my city was spun from your imaginings. You threaded the river through the needles of the canals, dug out with immigrant hands. You threaded the river through the needles of canals, dug out with immigrant hands. In your sleep, you turned the mills, the cogs and wheels, spooling bobbins by the millions to bind this world in silk and barely pay for the shop floor girl's bottle of milk. The river singing in the canals. I heard the river singing in the canals at dusk, the song of ice melt from the glacier 15,000 years ago. A humming sound streaming beneath old factory floors. The Kine-Tukut, the long river, has always searched for work. A trade route for Algonquin or Nonotuck. A job in the mill on the day or night shift. To be useful, to turn a turbine, make paper from rags into pages for reading and turning by hand. To turn a turbine, to make paper from rags into pages for reading by hand, stories and poems, food and water for the mind. This is for Frank and his sisters. This is the Ragman. Rags! Rags! His voice rounded the corner. The force of it heaved from his bulk on the buckboard seat. The clink of brass, the creak of leather harness, wagon wheels grinding over pavement, sounding like rocks out for a walk. The horse, a mix of Percheron or Clydesdale, sway-backed, head down, blinders on, spit frothing on the bit, the plodding clip-clop of hooves, the pace of a vanishing world. I heard in his voice the growl of fatigue, scorched from a cigar as old as he was. chewed with teeth the size of horse incisors at least. His face a grimace as if he'd been kicked or whipped. A Holocaust survivor who knew. His language hard as the iron he anchored the wagon with. His language hard as the iron he anchored the wagon with. The whole contraption tipped when he stepped down to stomp the ground, calling for cloth. The gunny sack of rags formed a hump on his back. He and his steed hauled down to the mills. 1958 hydromatic Oldsmobiles whizzing past them like a breeze. The yoke of his labor, our discarded clothes, rags, the fiber of the paper city's paper, rags, the fiber of the paper city's paper, washed by river water, pressed into blank pages, sealed with watermarks, cut into blank books, where I'd milled first letters into words, where I milled first letters into words, and later into poems about the place. I never spoke his name, never hollered, "Hey, Jake the Ragman's here," like John Kelly would. Once I dreamt about a barn down by the canals, where it was said he stabled his horse and himself. I see them both dozing there, the river roaring over the falls, flooding the factories and the world with books. So this is for Patrick. Asked me to read this. My nephew Patrick Shanahan is a great spirit and amazing human being, and he's just written a book about the real story about St. Patrick, and he's giving a reading at Borders.
Oh, Borders next weekend.
Borders, yeah, next weekend.
Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble up by Ingleside Mall, yeah. So I urge you to go see that. Meet Patrick. So this poem is for Elizabeth Shanahan, and in speaking to Ani Tuzman, a good friend of mine, the ground we stand on, you know, there's geological time, there's historical time, there's emotional time. But in many ways, my mother appears in this book a lot. And Annie pointed out to me is that the mother is the ground we stand on. Yeah. We wouldn't be here without the Divine Mother. Yeah. Potatoes, she said over the phone. Peel them, cut them in quarters, put them in a pot of water, boil them, and wait till I come home. This was my task in the years after he died. This and vacuuming. The house an empty tomb then. My brothers working in the mills down by the river. Herself at work. 3 jobs to carry the load for the 5 of us. Her patience worn thin by grief. Bitter as the tea that restored her. When she came home, it was best not to cross her. All the work she did with her hands, a fury of confidence in it. All the work she did with her hands, a fury of confidence in it. Even while knitting, she was running hard across the track of each row, dropping stitches, picking up a few on the way, dazzling her students in the dining room, repeating, knit 1, purl 2, knit 1, purl 2, as if it were one of the mysteries of the rosary. She hustled through her prayers too, as if someone were chasing her. She'd withdraw from us then, finding moments of sanctuary behind the sheer curtain of her faith, which she worked the same way she made bread, with her hands, pressing and kneading, pressing and kneading. She'd withdraw from us then, finding moments of sanctuary behind the sheer curtain of her faith, which she worked the same way she made bread, with her hands, pressing and kneading, pressing and kneading. Excuse me. The mangle. An old gold cigarette burning in the ashtray since 1922. She'd been smoking. She sat in front of the mangle, the mechanical contraption she fed our shirts and pants through, manipulating the levers with her knees, controlling the searing hot roller like workers in the mills along the canals. Our clothes hanging on a line across the kitchen like Buddhist prayer flags. The automated thing was supposed to make life easier. No one had any idea we had a sweatshop in the house. The white stitches of a surgery a grimace down the back of her neck. Coming home from work, she'd sell yarn from the living room, buy a cellar full from the textile salesman as hundreds of mills were closing up and down the river. She poured free tea for anyone who came through the door, outrunning the grief of widowhood and 4 sons to feed. Coming home from work, she'd sell yarn from the living room, buy a cellar full from the textile salesman. As hundreds of mills were closing up and down the river, she poured free tea for anyone who came through the door, outrunning the grief of widowhood and 4 sons to feed. So this is, I'll begin the Philip meditation and do Precious Lord in the middle and at the end. Yeah. Okay. This is called Philip a meditation. And Philip lived for 8 days. And the heart and mind of grief, they try to make sense of what's happening. And there's give and take between the heart and the mind. And strange things can be said and felt. There was great fear and terror among the disciples after the crucifixion of Jesus, who vanished soon after he was buried. It is said the Apostle Peter sent Philip, the deacon who tended to the sick, the poor, and widows, to teach the story of Jesus in the South. On his way to Syria, Philip met an Ethiopian who was struggling with a scripture from the Old Testament. Isaiah, it says, in the Acts of the Apostles. The Ethiopian, a eunuch from the court, asked Philip to resolve his scriptural conundrum, which he did. Philip then told him of Jesus, the resurrection, his fulfillment of the law. Then the man asked to be baptized. Philip waded into the sea, guiding his newfound friend, and then doused and blessed him in the water, in the manner of John with Jesus in the Jordan. When the man came up for air and opened his eyes, Philip vanished in a blazing flash of light.
This is play just one verse entering into this experience of death that really shouldn't happen. This brilliant black composer, Thomas Dorsey, early 1930s, his wife died in childbirth and the child died. In his deep grief, he composed this song. Well, the song came to him. It's called Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Lead me on to that land that is here, heaven that is somewhere else, and heaven that is here.
Thank you, Jonas. When Philip, my older brother, was born, his light burned for 8 days in the Valley of Brothers, where the Connecticut flows south from Holyoke to the sea. On the 8th day, when they came to feed him, Philip had vanished, leaving his little body behind. Many spoke of his brief life as the visitation of an angel who'd come to bless us, that once he had completed his work, he had no other purpose here. After all these years, I have no answers, but have a sense that he returned to the place he'd come from, that sun-blazed shore in Syria where he baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. After all these years, I have no answers, but have a sense that he returned to the place he'd come from, that sun-blazed shore in Syria where he baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. And my father is close by there with them at the hospital. He is weeping, his hands pressed against the window, the glass window of the nursery. Shimmering above the water is the number 8. Shimmering above the water is the number 8. Reclining on its side, a soul resurrecting in the sign of infinity. Shortly before she died at 83, our mother revealed to us, to my brother and I, as best she could, a story that had been sealed in the tomb of grief for more than 50 years. There was much confusion, she said, sorrow and rage. The doctors told her it was a choking accident. There were other half-truths, none of which could keep her from trembling in that hour, recalling her hopelessness and our father's despair. Her testament that day rolled back the tombstone of the past to reveal again what no one could explain. Her testament that day rolled back the tombstone of the past to reveal again what no one could explain. This is the gospel according to Elizabeth Shanahan. Philip in Greek means one who loves horses. The letters of Philip's name move like light through my mind. The letters of Philip's name move like light through my mind, and then effortlessly into the mouth, leaving a trace of the afterlife. Leaving a trace of the afterlife. No longer burdened with the many sorrows of this world. So this is the orphanage poem. Do that now. So this poem is dedicated to the children separated from their parents at the Mexican-U.S. border. And it has to do with a time that we spent in an orphanage here locally many years ago.
Thank you, Danny. You saw a slide a little bit ago of me playing a shakuhachi piece down in Arizona about 3 weeks ago. I was in the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, where the Trump's Wall is moving through sacred land of the Native American tribes. And I played a piece from Japan that my teacher taught me called Kojo no Tsuki, as my hand sometimes touched the cold steel of the border wall. Kojo no Tsuki means moon over the ruined castle. It's a sacred piece in Japan that is sometimes played at the end of a war or a great tragedy. What's left of a castle on a hilltop with a moon behind.
Thank you, Jonas. O Mother of mercy, our life, our sweetness, our hope, to Thee do we cry. O banished children of Eve. She was ill. We are placed in an orphanage near the river along Route 5. An auditorium of wailing children, nuns in drab brown garments, their rosaries sorrowful mysteries. Just one of the lost and frightened, I remember the good sister who took me into a room with a cot, lay down with me, and held me. Mother of mercy, Virgin of kindness, your arms embraced my fear and everyone's abandonment. Your arms embraced everyone's abandonment. Nails in the cross you wore, hidden under the stiffly starched white habit over your breast. Our abandonment were nails in the cross you wore, hidden under the stiffly starched white habit over your breast. After my father died, there were these two old guys in the neighborhood that lived right up the street. And they were from the old country. And they had rocking chairs up on this porch. And I was starting to get into trouble. And they knew that was going on. So but when I was coming home from school, they called me up onto the porch. And they taught me how to roll a cigarette, how to smoke a corncob pipe, and how to chew tobacco. Now that'll get you through where you were to the end of your life without any trouble, really. But anyway, and then they taught me how to, while I was doing that, while I was chewing tobacco, they taught me how to spit into a Hills Brothers coffee can from a moving rocking chair. Now, that wasn't on any of my resumes as I kind of applied for work. But if I could do that, I could do anything, right? So this is for George and George Conway and Jack Sullivan. And the poem is written, so it sounds like I'm only talking about one of them, but they're all wound in together. Beautiful old guys. They saved my life, really. There were seasons you passed through when you would not have thought to count the trees because you were in them. You wouldn't count the trees because you were in them. When your plowing days and factory days were over, you gave me a corncob pipe, a pouch of tobacco, and taught me to rub the rough cot in my palms until it was good for the lighting. I could sail with you then on that sea of smoke, hear tales of Fisk rubber. When the war was on, you marched into that plant you said every day and kept your mouth shut, by God. Toothless, saliva gumming your pipe bit wound with kite string. You showed me how to spit into a coffee can from a moving rocking chair, skills I've used to work the pedals and clutches of commerce. At night, I would visit you by your sickbed in the attic, the year-round one-piece long johns, the air dense with pipe and cigarette smoke, thick as the brogue from the old country, your fingernails and hair varnished yellow with nicotine.
You spoke of those teams of horses you harnessed to clear the hills for the fairways across the valley. As you spoke, the sweat poured down from under your wool pixie hat, your nose dripping. You puffed away and away past the time when you would not have thought to count the trees because you were in them. In winter, you'd retreat to the cellar by the furnace, reading Zane Grey or Louis L'Amour, pointing your pipe at remembered places in the air, the wisdom of your hindsight going up in smoke. You laughed and cursed, sons of bitches, Jesus Christ, goddamn, my mouth burning with tobacco juice. You who'd cut out the sides of mountains with your hands, stacked enough tires to cover all of Hampden County. And you leaned when you listened to my ragtime tales of the schoolyard. You leaned when you listened to my ragtime tales of the schoolyard. As if my mother were not alone in her grief. As if she had not wept over his body against her will. As if she were not a few houses away from this sanctuary of tobacco and the coarse language of men who sheltered me that year from the torment of her loss. Who sheltered me that year from the torment of her loss. Handmaiden. It was the Lamb of God in Latin I loved to chant. The resonance of it echoing off the stone cavern of the church. As I knelt there next to her in the pew, her head bowed in prayer, eyes sealed in solemnity. The smell of old gold cigarettes and perfume thick as the wool of her handmade suit, this handmaiden whose garments were made from lambs. Occasionally, when on the altar serving Mass, my brothers and I would suddenly hear her fearsome cough, ricocheting across the chasm of the place. That threatening, phlegm-garbled code of warning not to screw up because herself and God were watching. Then the relief of mercy came down from the choir loft. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi. Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world, have mercy on me. Uncle Jimmy. Once at dinner, Thanksgiving or Easter, Uncle Jimmy put a Camel cigarette in his mouth, chewed it all up, showed the wet wad of pulp to us on the tip of his tongue, swallowed it, zipped his lips with a finger, closed his eyes, and went silent. We waited. Strips of beef and dollops of mashed potatoes went cold on our plates. When he opened his eyes, from his mouth came a perfectly rolled dollar bill, which he lit up with flair. I was 10 years old then. My father was still alive and more than ready to pull a puppy from his top coat, coming in the door after 3 weeks on the road, selling kitchenware from Buffalo to Holyoke. It was 1958. I could smell the booze on that dog, which he yanked like a pint from his inside pocket, dropping it on my mother's immaculately conceived dining room table. I recall my father telling someone over the phone, "You aren't home yet until you can piss in your own backyard." Every once in a while, I'll remember that dollar cigarette sticking out of Uncle Jimmy's mouth and that astonished dog among the crystal candle holders. And I'll step outside in the dark and take a leak near the skunk hole behind the tool shed. Annie Kay. You remember Annie Kay? Yeah. This is Annie Kay. It's beautiful. She looked like something out of a detective novel from the 30s. But anyway. Your black, perfectly coiffed hair, white gloves, two-tone navy and white heels, your face caged in a chapel veil, your cigarette. There were no children, there was Uncle Jimmy, and there was booze everywhere when they found you alone, in the living room, in the teacup of a house, south of Boston, Our Lady of the Parish, little orchid of madness. My poem, a petal on the harsh stone of your end. Okay. The Voice. Song for Elizabeth Shanahan. She did not have a great voice, but she sang anyway in the kitchen as she baked. How often I heard her singing that way, I cannot say. The summit of the mountain visible in the window above the sink. I remember flour everywhere. Her hands an apron dusted wipe, pressing and kneading, her fists forcing mounds of dough into loaves. With a cigarette in her mouth, her voice was low and smoky. Peggy Lee, a cappella. On a summer evening when I was 5, we stood holding hands on the shore of Narragansett Bay. Above the dark channel, a ship of stars drifted in the silence. Above the dark channel, a ship of stars drifted in the silence. Many years later, she would find it hard to breathe. The ghosts of the old gold dancers on the Ed Sullivan TV show, headless, costumed in huge cigarette packs, tapped their toxic message across the airwaves. My brother was there when she inhaled her last breath, let out its burnt, one-note song. I found my voice in a bar room at 18, forced to sing by a bartender to pay a tab. This is the voice that carries the tune for her, the one she gave to me while making bread in the kitchen that day. Aunt Lillian's grapefruit. Alone each winter, Aunt Lillian drove the long road north from Florida to Massachusetts. I'd run to greet her when she pulled up in the eggshell blue Chrysler, like a July sky over Tampa, defrosting our frigid air. When the door opened, cigarette smoke blew off her like a trade wind. As her flowery sandals touched down on the snow, a vodka bottle rolled out from underneath the car seat. A few years earlier, a call came in the middle of the night. I heard my father consoling Aunt Lillian over the phone, my mother repeating in the dark, "Who is it? What's wrong?" The room at the end of the hall seemed swollen with disbelief. I cannot recall him ever moving so slowly as he did then in his grief. I saw him as other than father, a brother who had lost a brother that night. All during her visit, she wore her plastic flowered slippers, her silk bathrobe with fur trim, a rock glass of iced gin in one hand and a butt in the other, my mother obliging her with chagrin. I saw this as a kind of wrestling match. The tanned Magdalene of Fort Lauderdale meets Our Lady of Penance from Worcester. Aunt Lil's fingernails were like fire alarms. Her efforts at blonde hair turned to whisk brooms, but she still looked to me like the Clairol lady on the backs of women's magazines. I don't remember what happened to her or when she died. She was the first sign of sex in the family. Even her offerings of perfectly crated and wrapped pink grapefruit caused excitement. My brothers and I would cut them in half, section the fruit and eat, and then the game began. We squeezed the skins again and again to see how many spoonfuls of juice we could press from the pulp. I could never get past 9. This early lesson in my sums taught me one measure of a man and warned of the limits of my strength. Soon after, I would fall out of step and learn in my own sad time the violence of wanting more than what the fruit can yield. Soon after, I would fall out of step and learn in my own sad time the violence of wanting more than what the fruit can yield. There was a rooming house on the corner of Appleton and Chestnut, right next to the Social Security building. And this is a story about that, 2 poems about that rooming house. I'm in high school, a night shift salad boy, hitchhiking from class to the steakhouse on Route 5, paying $12 a week in cash and empties. Left outside the manager's door. There's no phone and no one is calling me. But the lady down the hall invites me in one night for a long talk. I can no longer hear her voice, but see her sexy glasses, the naked windows over Poverty Alley. She's in control. And yet, we're both fumbling. We're both so hungry, our bodies, food, desire, crumbling like cake in the dark. All the factories closing, burning down, the flames blazing on the black waters of the canals. And yet, we're both fumbling. We're both so hungry, our bodies, food, desire, crumbling like cake in the dark. All the factories closing, burning down, the flames blazing on the black waters of the canals. Donald Duxbury. It's 3 o'clock in the morning in the rooming house. The paper mills are humming along the canals. I'm 15 in my one-room abode with a mirror and a sink. I feel the bed shaking. It's Donald, rousing me with a bottle in his hand. Time for a beer, he said. I see the door is closed, the transom is locked, and the windows are sealed. No idea how he got in. A shadow of himself slipped through the door jamb, maybe. The next day, my little transistor radio is missing. I ask around. The old people tell me to go see Donald on the 5th floor. His door is open. The old people tell me someone's fan is there too. And Donald's living pretty good. He's got 2 rooms, not a bad view of the alleyway. There's a ball game on TV, a few toasters and hair dryers scattered about. Hey, Donald, have you seen my radio? Oh yeah, it's near the refrigerator. He doesn't get up. He's drinking. His mind's on the ball game. Later, one of my neighbors tells me Donald's a B&E guy, breaking and entering guy, has a hard time sleeping, and practices stealing at night to keep his skill intact, and if anything goes missing, we all go up to his place and get it back. This way, he works out his kleptomania without having to go back to prison. I was just getting over being an altar boy then. Heard a lot of talk about Jesus' tolerance and understanding, but this took it to a whole new level. If you'd ever been locked up in a cell block, you'd know this room, if you'd ever been locked up on a cell block, you'd know this rooming house justice was just what the country needed. Find the library poem. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Ani. By the way, these are available, these posters of certain poems, and this is dedicated to the library. And obviously, we're here to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the library. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Okay. It's 1963. I'm walking down to the library. My father has left this world for another. I packed the chaos of grief up the steps of the Parthenon, between giant Greek pillars. Through massive dark doors Beowulf himself might have passed through to the great storyteller's beer hall. The world I carried fell away for a time, like that closet wall dissolving in the witch and the wardrobe. Opening onto a parallel universe, I was welcomed by gracious librarians, guardians of the kingdom, descendants of the chief priests of the Library of Alexandria, Egypt, circa 3rd century. They knew the way through the dark forest of the Dewey Decimal System. The colossal circular welcome desk, a starship cockpit, command center of the galaxy of books, many of which were once scrolls of lambskin or papyrus. Silence, the oldest of all languages, moved among the stacks. The unspoken reverence for written words and those that pondered them. If the world wants peace, it could not do better than spend time in this library. Here on the floor of cubed opaque glass, I snoozed after gorging on free books piled on my lap. Books that longed to be held, to be read, to leap in the open country of the mind. High above, first people fished and hunted along the Connecticut, on murals drifting across the vast sky of the lobby. Everyone at the campsite, Sante Graziani's masterful stroke tells us, were peaceful. Before the Dutch, French, and British ensnared the tribes in fur trade and real estate wars. In the reading room, long white pine poles lay in racks, newspapers curing on them like tobacco leaves in the vented barns along the river. Old mill workers puffed plumes of pipe smoke as they grazed on print in the palace of the paper city. Old mill workers puffed plumes of pipe smoke as they grazed on print in the palace of the paper city. In the audio room, headphones the size of catcher's mitts channel the thunderous poems of Dylan Thomas, the haunting rhymes of Yeats, spinning on 78 RPM vinyl records, big as hula hoops, turning speech into song in the head forever, turning speech into song in the head forever. A library is a kind of ship embraced on the sea of curiosity, stored in its hold, the cargo of the world's language, hauled to the port of each generation. A library is a kind of ship. An unfathomable generosity guides her voyage. Unlike cathedrals in a library, questions are sacred, which translates to we are sacred just because we exist. Here the tabernacle of the mind is opened and filled. For a library and its librarians shelter you, accept you, honor you, serve you, bless you, educate you. They know the ark of the library's covenant is human imagination. A library is an architecture of the mind, for the mind, and by the mind. A sanctuary for the treasure hoard of the ages. One of the subtitles of the ground we stand on is the character of the landscape and the landscape of characters. One of those characters for me was alcoholism. And so from that rooming house, it was a long haul to where I recovered from that. And as well as drug addiction. You know, we didn't create this condition. And some of us get more of it than we want. And I think as a society, we're just starting to wake up that it's not a crime. And so this was a dream that I had the night before I got sober, 1973 in Alaska, on a little dirt road called Bowery Lane in the wilderness north of Anchorage. Recovery. I am dreaming. It's a nightmare. I'm falling and falling. And as I fall, the darkness holds nothing but itself. As I fall, the darkness holds nothing but itself. An endless bottom forever of fear and terror. And when I came to the end that I thought was never there, I am broken, shattered, just enough to let the light in, to call out for help. Miraculously, someone comes out of nowhere in the middle of the night. Someone I don't know, who doesn't know me, and it doesn't matter. I have just enough self to take that hand, to recover, to climb out from the chaos of addiction, to discover again, slowly, that love for myself I had lost long ago. To discover again, slowly, that love for myself I had lost long ago. So we're getting a little on here. I just wanted to. Interesting. Okay. And this is, we'll end with this. My father's Buddha. His office is empty, my father's absence as much a presence as the old steam radiator gone silent. The room cold, upon it a paperweight, a bronze Buddha, sitting in the lotus position in perfect peace, doing its work since I could remember, a sheen of serenity on his lips. As my father made his calls, he'd pick him up and put him back down on top of a file to keep the world from blowing away. He was perfectly cast for this role, this monk. Ours was a Catholic house. He was the first sign of a false god in the neighborhood. There are specks of unbaked debris in his bronze skin. Flaws I understood to mean you can be a little screwed up and still be able to meditate. After my father left his body, the Buddha kept on working. Like a relief pitcher, walking out to the mound, finishing the game for the old man. Years later, returning from India, I visited the house and took the Buddha with me. He's still meditating. He's in good shape, not putting on any weight that I can see, nor aged any either. When I pass by him during the day, I slow down, and I see my father and him at work. My father who taught meditation in his own way. Relax, he said. Take a deep breath. Keep your eye on the ball. Lean into it. And then sacrifice yourself so the guy on third can score. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Jonas. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I really have to thank Sandy Ward, who ended up moving across the street from where my mother lived on Nonotuck Street just before she died. So Sandy, come on up here. I wouldn't be here today without Sandy. She invited me back to the library I don't know, 10 years ago or so, so thank you.
Oh.
Yeah. And so she does a lot of work here for the library and for membership and awareness of the library, and so God bless you. And Maria, is she here?
Yes.
Maria, we want to thank you for welcoming us today, for making space, but for your genius, your science, your knowledge, your patience, your compassion, the captain of this ship. Beautiful, thank you. Thank you. Also, I want to thank Rosie Pearson here. Rosie, please say. Rosie was, along with Carla and some other people, were my editors on this new book. It kind of came together very quickly over the past 6 weeks once we were invited to read here today. So thank you. Beautiful work.
It's beautiful.
I want to thank Ani Tuzman. She's the author of an amazing book called the Baal Shem Tov, Tremble of Love, the Baal Shem Tov. Please talk to Annie. Find out about this book and her website. It will change and nourish your life.
There's refreshments over here.
Yes, okay.
You're welcome to stay.
And thank you for coming today. God bless you. Oh, and we said, yeah, Jonas, thank you. Yes. And Johan. He is the director of the CCTV channel here, and he's doing this amazing work of capturing the art and culture of the city. So thank you, Johan. Thank you.
I want to add just one story. When I moved to Holyoke 25 years ago, this June, my second day in the house, I didn't know that I moved into the house that's across the street from where he grew up. I didn't know he might have and it was hot, humid. I was fed up with the boxes. I was beyond anything I could do anymore. And it was sticky heat in June. It was awful. And then a thunderstorm came through and kind of broke the heat. And Nonotuck Street becomes a river.
Yeah.
Going down to the dingle there. Mm-hmm. And I just went out to cool myself off. And I saw that river, and I looked up the street, and I looked down the street, and there was nobody there. I took off my shoes, and I went out, stood and this voice from straight across the road said, "If I were younger, I'd join you."
That's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.